Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Caleb Teskey, and today I'm joined by Victoria Litman from Rhode Island. Victoria, thank you for being here with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be
Um,
here.
sure. So before we get into anything serious, off the top, I like to ask my guests if they'll give me a 5 minute life story.
All right, 5 minutes. Is it like a timed thing or
Well,
am I just
some of the rest of this is going to be your life story also, but just
okay?
like the basic
Yeah,
background.
yeah, sure. I grew up in Northern Virginia, like outside of DC. And as a kid, my dream was to be an astronaut. I was really passionate about like thinking about like the future and yeah, like I always like to think about, if we were going to have a library on the moon, like what books would be in that and who gets to make those decisions. And I kind of took that like dream of being an astronaut very seriously. So I like did like NASA internships. I took really hard math and science. And I ended up going to USC out in LA for college, which is like where a lot of private space industry is. So I started as an astronautical engineering major and then realized it was like no fun. Just like the professors weren't really engaging, and I was like flying all the way across the country to spend all this money to go to school to like listen to a professor read out of a book. And so I found a lot more value in religion classes. And growing up, I was also really involved in like a Jewish community, Jewish day school, Jewish education. And so I kind of came into college with like, I'll be an engineer and minor in religion. And then by the end, it was like, I'm just going to major in religion, and that there's a lot more value for me coming and like being in LA to learn about that. And yeah, that's relevant to why I'm here too, because being in LA as like an 18-year-old, I was able to get medical cannabis when I wasn't even legally able to buy alcohol. And I could get a med card and go to a dispensary. I mean, this was pre 2016. So, like, now as a lawyer, it's like quasi legal, but I mean, it's legal in the sense of like, using my real ID and my real age, I could qualify under state law to access medical cannabis. And that really changed my life, like personally, medically, spiritually. And then also sort of my career path, realizing, not just that these laws were so state specific, not just that medical cannabis could really help me, but also that there was this really horrible legal history, criminal law, mass incarceration, mass criminalization that was a part of that. And so it was really all tied up with like this passion for justice and community, and also my own healing. Yeah, and so that led me to I got a graduate degree in divinity, a religion and law, master's of divinity at Union Theological Seminary. And while I was there, I was writing and thinking about drug laws as reparations for harm of the war on drugs. And what is like this theological and philosophical ideas behind social justice, and how can we realize that through drug laws. So yeah, then went to law school to kind of continue on that. And yeah, really was open with everyone along the way. I'm passionate about drugs. Thankfully, by the time I was able to, like when I moved to New York for graduate school, medical was already legal in New York. This was like 2016. And so I was a medical patient in New York pretty early. In terms of New York's trajectory, it was very, very bad coming from California, where I worked as a bud tender. I had all my choices of cultivars and products. And then New York was like isolated THC CBD ratio. I mean, really low quality, really expensive. And so my experience as a patient really, I guess, shaped my desire to get engaged on the policy side of things. Yeah, and then last year I did this tax LLM on top of my law degree where tax is kind of on one hand like how people will access cannabis, how businesses succeed. And but also I'm really passionate, like I said, about religion, religious communities, and tax exempt organizations. So that was like, I don't know if that was 5 minutes or what, but that's a lot of where I am now. So now I live in Rhode Island. I got married along the way, and my partner got a great job in Rhode Island at a synagogue. And so I'm very fortunate to have been able to move to Rhode Island. I think it's a great place to live. I love New England. I think New England is really like an underrated, incredible cannabis scene in the country because like California, the market's really falling, the prices are dropping, there's oversaturation. But in New England, because the state's also California's so big, so within the state, like you're competing within the state, but you're not competing like you're not really competing California, Oregon when you're in LA. You're just not because like it's just so big. But up here, I think there really is like where I live in Rhode Island, I'm about a mile or two from Massachusetts. So there's Massachusetts market, there's the Rhode Island market, there's the Maine market. I know Vermont's coming online too. And then Connecticut and New York are coming too. Although I don't see them as really good competition. But Mass, Maine, and Rhode Island, I think, have really strong markets, and hopefully Vermont more and more, like small growers, quality growers. quality products. Yeah, and you really are competing on price and tax and everything because as a consumer in Rhode Island, I can choose. Yeah, I think it's a misnomer. It's just something as like a lawyer, people talk about like, oh, well, it's federally illegal to cross whatever straight line, but it's federally legal to buy and consume in the state that you live in too. Like it's the same federal law that you're breaking. So for
Thank you.
me, it's
Thank you
like
for saying that, Victoria.
it's not legal advice, but like it's just like I thought there are legal scholars that debate about this, but I think the general idea is like you're not there's no like oh federal law kicks in once you cross the state line.
Yeah.
Like it's already applying to you in the state. So now we got into the law stuff. So I'll sip some coffee and see what you want to talk about.
I got a couple follow-up questions. Which books would you put on the moon?
Oh man.
Pick
Well, I think it's
one,
like an on one.
or pick a couple maybe.
Okay. This is gonna like this is gonna sound weird and like particularly like if you know if my husband hears this podcast interview, whatever. Like I really think the Bible I would put on not because I think the Bible's like the Word of God or not because I think the Bible's like the ultimate. And when I say the Bible, I'm talking about like I guess the what would be called the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, these five books. I just as like a person who thinks about history and intergenerational stories, like this is a collection of stories that have been passed down and it's not the only one. And like I think there could be arguments for other similar historic religious books
Sure.
being included as just like wow, this is wisdom passed over time, which is pretty amazing. Um,
It is the
I
best-selling
guess
book ever, right?
right, like it's so
Better.
and like there's so many interpretations of it, and there's so much like meaning making that you get from it, and it's amazing to read pieces of it like Ecclesiastes or something, and you're like this could be written now, and like just the I guess it kind of pulls out what is really human and like what kind of questions are we asking, what kind of dynamics are we exploring, like all the family dynamics. It's funny, it's like I don't know if I would expect that to be the answer. I think that's where that religion and space stuff intersected for me, like the cultural. I'm trying to think what other book. I don't know, I'm writing a book, so maybe my book eventually.
There
um
you go.
I don't know. Right now with the internet, it's such a different idea, right? Because it's like, well, you could have a Kindle and you could access like all the books in the world. So like, or Wikipedia, like Google,
That's
I don't
right.
know, Twitter. Like, I think so much too now. I feel like more people who are like, oh, I'm not into social media, like I'm not into TikTok or I'm not into Twitter, and like that's fine, like you're entitled to that, and like that's where news is breaking first. Like if you turn on the news on the TV, they're bringing up tweets from a week ago
I
and
don't.
like bringing
I
up
don't turn
TikToks
that
from a
on.
week ago. Right. Like I was in a hotel in California last week and I turned on the news and they're literally like showing TikToks from a week prior. I'm just like, or bringing up tweets, right? And it's like, why not just be with the news when it's being, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think those platforms and like the database of information that's stored there. I'm trying to think of like another book that I'd be like, oh, I need it to be there. I don't know. There's a book I really liked called Psychoactive Sacramentals, which is a collection of essays written around 2000 by a bunch of like religious studies professors, but also like Rick Doblin, like other psychedelic researchers, people that were involved in this arena of ideas around the future of religion and religious use of psychedelics. Um, so I that book has really provided me with a lot of insight, and it kind of yeah is a good reminder that like there's this like history of psychedelic research and science, but there's also a really strong history of religious use, not just ancient history, but like modern history.
Mm.
This isn't like this new thing, it's like this continuing thing. That's a
Hmm.
good question. I brought it up. I don't know. I should have a better
Yeah.
answer.
I was just curious.
What would yours be like if you had one book that you're like, I want humanity to have this book?
I'd probably go with something like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or something, maybe. That seems
Yeah.
like a good one. Um, yeah, yeah. I got nothing else. The other thing I wanted to ask you, it sounded like you said you were a bud tender in there out in California. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, this was like 2015, 2014, sort of like a college part-time opportunity. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it really one thing that stands out at the time is like, I was weighing pot, like, and I was just sorting pot and smelling and interacting with flower. And our patients that were coming in were getting to do that as well. Like, oh, well, what do I want today? I don't know. Why don't you smell this? Smell Church OG, smell King Louis, smell some Jack, smell some Blue Dreams, like, and pricing and working with people. The neighborhood, I went to USC, so the neighborhood was like, really like USC's gentrifying this neighborhood. So a lot of the people that were coming in were really like in need of medicine and maybe like couldn't afford very much. And so the regulations weren't really, wasn't heavily regulated. So we had the freedom to like sell a joint or sell some shake for like $1, right? Like, and that I felt like was real access for people, which was pretty amazing. Just like
Yeah,
being able to meet people where they were at.
for patients, that's got to be huge.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's pros and cons. Like, it wasn't heavily tested. It wasn't, and I also felt like this was one thing that frustrated me. So my favorite cultivars, Jack Herer, like just smelly, terpenoline, like delicious, good, like great. I think great flower, great daytime flower for me. And like I would get it at that dispensary. Eventually, I'm working there, and I'd be like, oh well, I guess like what a dispensary's interest is in selling a certain product is not the same as like the patient's interest. So like if someone comes in and is like, "Oh, I really want Jack," my boss might say, "Oh, well, we have Jack, but I'm trying to get rid of this Blue Dream. So why don't you just tell them that we don't have Jack and we can sell Blue Dream?" And that really like I didn't like I that really like
I hate
didn't sit
that.
well
Yeah,
with me. Yeah, I was like, "No, this is about getting the patient like what they want, and if we have what they want, we should give it to them."
crazy,
Um,
crazy idea.
yes. Yeah, I mean, like I learned a lot from it, right? Yeah. And just that this is like people are coming in and it's not just a transaction for them. Like I could see like the role of dispensary is like a community center. And I feel that as someone who lives in like sort of a small city, Providence is pretty small. You go in places and people. And I belong to a community synagogue here and people and you go in and you talk to people. And even if I'm going to like buy a coffee, I still have a relationship with a lot of people. And I think that's like a bud tender at its best, is like a community member who has like ongoing relationships with people. And when people come in, like they don't want to just like always like buy their product. For some people, it's also like, I want to have a conversation.
Right.
I want to feel like seen. I want to like talk to someone who's
No, it's like going
cool.
to the grocery store. You run into people. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I don't like dispensary is community center. So I thought that was like something that it became appeared like clear to me. And it's also like a spiritual thing. Like some people would come in and it's not just like a medicine. It's like yeah, it's cannabis is amazing because it's so many things. It's like a fun recreation. It's like a spiritual tool. It's a medicine. It's a yeah,
Hmm.
and that came to life as a bud tender.
Cool. Um, you also like, boy, I saw you were on the Chillinois podcast, and I got call coming on here in a couple of weeks, and I was wondering if you got any dirt on him or something cool I could ask him because I'm gonna listen to your interview later. But
Yeah. Oh man, he's fun. He's cool. He knows a lot about all kinds of stuff. I mean, I think what like I would ask him about the church. Like we talked about religious freedom stuff a lot because that's a core area of my interests and my advocacy. Um, and I think like he also he may have interviewed someone from like the Satanic Temple,
you did, yeah.
like to try and like think about like what is religious freedom for everyone look like. So I think that's an interesting thing to talk to him about. And then also like I've shared a lot about, and it's like something, it's this like when we're talking about psychedelics or cannabis, there's like descheduling, there's decriminalizing, there's deprioritizing, there's legalizing, there's regulating, there's a whole spectrum of like legal approaches. Um, and I definitely think decriminalization is where I fall, but then like I also think we should decriminalize sex work, which is something that I think he really also supports. But I think there's a big difference for me, which it can be helpful to throw out to people, which I've learned also from talking with other advocates. Like when we talk about decriminalizing sex work, we really just mean decriminalizing sex work because in terms of like safe supply, if there was like an equivalent, like sex workers can already go get medical health services. Like that's the equivalent. When we're talking about drugs, like we actually do want safe supply. Like we actually like just decriminalizing drugs wouldn't totally solve the problems. It would be it is a necessary first step. But we also actually do want some degree of regulation or oversight because there are financial incentives to like, sell snake oil mislabeled. And
Absolutely.
like patients, need to be able to rely on that. So that was my sneaky way of bringing that point in. But also
Cool.
like that if you're talking about decriminalizing sex work and just sort of like these variations of decriminalizing, and I know he's big too on like he'll say like, oh, the tomato model or whatever. And I think cannabis is going to be regulated in a lot of different ways, depending on how you're accessing it and the quality of it, and synthetic versus organic or naturally occurring. But I don't know. Like I think he falls more on like, oh, we shouldn't have any regulation at all. And I'm like, I think we need some. I'm just trying to figure out how to do it.
Sometimes I feel that way about, well, in terms of like like direct to consumer sales, like I thought they should have maybe set it up so that small growers could just take their product to the farmers market, because it's like any other product. Like, if you go to a grocery store and you see some moldy tomatoes or something, you're not going to buy it. And also, some of those tomatoes are sprayed with pesticides. But like, if you know your farmer and you trust the guy, I don't see any problem with that transaction. And
Well, it's like
I think people should be allowed to make that choice if they want to.
no, I definitely agree with that. And like you see that with the main caregiving model. And you see that with like the, existing market or legacy market. I don't know. These terms get so like washed and then they don't even mean what you think they mean. But anyone who's operating without a license and who doesn't feel compelled to go get a license because the license and the burdensome regulations and the taxes and the licenses are competitive depending on the state, whatever. Like a lot of their work and their business comes from this trust economy, or like extensions of it. And I do think it's like it's a balance. It's like, yeah, we need to keep patients safe and also like people trust there's a trust aspect. And like people are not dying in mass from contaminated flour.
But
Yeah. Like I grew my own. It's hard, but like you can kind of tell if it's moldy. I mean, and you're not trying, I don't know. It's like the fentanyl and cannabis stuff. It's like that doesn't make sense. Like there's just it doesn't make sense to like hide a drug that you can sell for more in a drug that is cheaper. Like
absolutely, thank you. Oh man, I've been trying to tell
yeah.
people that forever. And a lot of those, yeah, whatever. That's a whole other thing. I don't want to get off topic.
It's bad faith. No, it's all just like bad faith arguments. It's like how do I have a similar mind of thinking with like one of the book I'm writing. There's an essay called "What About the Children," where it's like people are like, oh no, don't worry. When we legalize pot, the kids are not going to get it. Like, don't worry. It's kind of like that. It's like, oh, well, don't worry. Like, it's like we can regulate it and make it safer, but we're not saying like it's like we have to be careful. Like, we don't want to imply something we're not trying to imply. Like in the situation with regulation, like we're not trying to say, oh, well, actually, it's inherently dangerous. It needs to be regulated, but we are saying there is some amount of regulation that would be helpful.
Sure.
And like with children too, it's like, no, kids, we want to make sure kids who need it can get it and that's part of legalization. It's not like, oh, we're going to legalize so kids can't get it.
I
It's
know,
like we're
like
going to legalize.
they give 8-year-olds Adderall. I really don't
Right.
understand. That one has always been like a weird hypocrisy to me that I really don't get.
I think
Well,
it's
it's
just
FDA
fear.
approved. Sorry. So that seems to be the only thing. They're like, well, the government said it's safe, so I know.
Yeah, I don't buy it either, but I think it's important to like not be. It's like it's nuance that like when people are out there, like there's a governor of Midwestern Nebraska or something who was like, "We're gonna legalize pot and it's gonna kill your kids." Like there's not a lot of room for like nuance in that. But the truth is like it's just more. There just needs to be more conversation about a lot of this stuff and
Sure.
yeah,
And
which hopefully no, go ahead.
no, no, I was going to switch topics to the testing thing, because even with the regulations, that was the whole like point of this, like, oh, it's going to be safe and tested. But I'm seeing in a ton of places across the country, falsified potency results, maybe even some bait and switches with different products going in the jars after they've tested, a nicer product. Um, and honestly, like, if we can't even get a safe tested product to the shelf, doesn't that kind of undermine the entire process here of trying to do this in a regulated way?
No, absolutely. And I've heard that too. I mean, well, first of all, like just the unreliability of testing, the like idea that THC should mean really anything more than just like another, statistic from the plant that should be like the most central and we should be trying to find a batch that might have the most. And I've also heard about what you're saying, like get something tested and then like put something else on the shelf. I know I've been appreciating that there's sort of like this other problem that goes along with that. And it's disappointing because like even I was out in California and I could smoke like the best weed from like a regenerative outdoor farmer, like amazing. And then I go buy it like at the dispensary and it's horrible. Like it's like the quality degradation, I think is also a part of this, where it's like we're regulating it to the point where you can't even get quality on the shelf because it takes too long. Um, like because the terpenes degrade, like just the quality of the plant matter
Well, we
degrades.
only have one lab
Um,
in the entire state here, and they're actually closed right now. And I've had people tell me up to 5 weeks turnaround time.
yeah, like I heard in California, the minimum is going to be 2 months from like package to shelf. Um,
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, look, and that's why I mean the legal market in California is like a what not to do. I mean, it's failing in a lot of different ways. And somehow, I mean, there's some amazing small cultivators that are trying to persevere. But I mean, I think like the benefit is that most consumers don't know better. Like, I mean, it's not good. I want to educate consumers so that they know better, on all fronts, like on like the, testing side of things, on like what quality could be. But I mean, a lot of consumers today are like, oh, well, what we can get now is so much better than what we could get. And like maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean it's as good as what it should be if it were at its quality. And that isn't frustrating because farmers and people spend so much energy, like making quality product, and then kind of gets squished during the time period of like regulation, which makes it, from like a sophisticated consumer, you don't want to spend more for lower quality. Like you just don't. Like,
No,
why am
I
I?
don't.
Yeah, like I don't. I just, and it's weird. It's like this mindset shift when you've been around a lot of weed, which it seems like you have too, where it's like at the beginning you're like, oh, any weed's good weed, like I'll smoke any weed. And then now I'm like, no, like why am I going to put something in my body that doesn't, you know, isn't good for me, and I can feel it and I can tell. And yeah, which is disappointing because you want to create access for people. But I've been trying to like wrap my head around it because, like I can go to the grocery store and buy, muffins that are like made with processed and preservatives and
Right.
whatever, and then I can go to like a bakery and get fresh baked muffins that are maybe made like, so I maybe there is a space for this like corporatized or poor quality weed, but it's disappointing when there are quality craft growers whose product isn't able to, realize its full value because of the regulations.
Great point. And I think the space really is only there because people don't know what good weed looks like. A lot of the newbies coming up, I guarantee you, it, a lot of those places would go out of business if everybody knew what they were looking like, knew what the good shit looked like.
Someone on Twitter, and like it's not even about, it's so hard to figure out how you educate people, but someone on Twitter said to me like, but basically that weed is like an acquired taste, and that it's like it's not a good taste and it's acquired. And I'm like, you need to smoke better weed. Like if you've smoked a lot of good weed with like a lot of different terpene profiles, and also like the acquired taste, the taste that a lot of people have that they associate with weed is the chemical fertilizer. That's what you're tasting. You're not actually tasting the actual terpenes or the weed. And it's like people don't want to hear that. People don't want to hear that like this idea of what they have with weed is like, is the shit that's in the weed, not actually the weed. And it's hard, but like as someone, and I've been really lucky, and I'm licensed in California. I've spent time in California, in like meeting with growers and just trying like from like ice water hash to like just good flower. And you realize the taste palette of cannabis is like an essential aspect to enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
At least for me, like I said, like, look, there could
That's
be a market for
everything, really.
people.
Taste is really everything for me. I
Right. I
don't
mean,
care.
like experience this.
Some of it doesn't look so good. Like I've tasted some amazing shit that you probably doesn't have great bag appeal, but I don't care about the bag appeal really. It's nice for consumers, but I like the taste.
Well, maybe that's sophisticated consumers. And I'm like, I got to be open that there might be a space, but I think people should at least know, like, if you don't think about going to buy weed and trying it, like trying candy, then like you're smoking, like you're missing out, right? Like, it's not all sweet, but I love fruity stuff. Right now, there's a lot of fruity stuff out there, especially
I
like
do too.
the
I'm a fruit
the
head. Yeah, yeah.
concentrates. Yeah, yeah. Like I was trying like fruit punch, papaya juice, like pineapple, whatever, and I'm like, this all like has very distinct fruity, like intense flavor. That's so fun. And
Mhm.
like, yeah, like it makes it less of this like, oh, I'm gonna like dab and just be like knocked out, which is but it's like literally this is an experience. Maybe like people feel like drinking alcohol, which I don't really drink at all. I just don't enjoy like that kind of poison. but yeah, so maybe that's how people feel about wine or something like a wine tasting, like I don't think people think about weed that way enough
Hmm.
because they don't have access to it, to your point.
Hmm. Word up. I want to try to tie in some of the psychedelics. See, like you are at a very like interesting crossroads of like cannabis and psychedelics and religion because boy, like that's I imagine I'm gonna guess here, but I would imagine in like a lot of organized religions, like, drug use is kind of frowned upon. I don't know if that's accurate, but also you got the legal angle, so like yeah, that's very strange. How has it been accepted by like sort of the Jewish community?
Yeah, I think that the idea that most organized religion, if you were like thinking traditional organized religion in this country, I wouldn't say they're mostly like drug enthusiasts. I mean, like they're alcohol, right? Like there's a lot of alcohol tolerance. But like the other drugs like that I enjoy. I like to talk about alcohol as an entheogen, which is like a sociological word to describe a drug used in religious settings, an entheogen. And like I think alcohol is an entheogen, at least like for us as Jewish people, like we have, Kiddush wine every week and we use this wine to celebrate, the holiness of Shabbat. And like to me, that's a entheogenic practice. I think that my desire is never to like come in and like try and convince other people that they should think what I think because I think it. I more just want to kind of like live by example in a sense. I think one of the things that really helps me is that I have a law degree and a tax LLM. Like I'm not coming to this topic of like psychedelic use of religion from like I'm going to change Judaism. I'm coming at it from a legal lens and broadening religious freedom. And interestingly, like I kind of came to it like as an undergrad at USC, I took a class on religion and law, and we read a bunch of the major cases, Supreme Court cases. I mean, I came to it because my own use and my own passion and whatever, but realizing that there are actually two major Supreme Court cases from the last 30 years dealing with religious use of psychedelics. Like this is not like an asterisk. This is like a central core part of our religious freedom history, legal history in this country.
What were
And
those cases? Could you give us like
yeah,
a brief?
sure. Yeah, so there's a case called Division v. Smith, which was a huge case in the religious freedom landscape, but dealt with some people in Oregon, Native Americans who used peyote as part of like drug addiction treatment. Was part of religious ceremony. Sorry, it was part of religious ceremony, but they were working at a treatment center, and so they got like fired from their job for doing that outside because it had like you can't use any drugs. Which I had a professor at Georgetown who was like, oh well, it was so stupid of them to think they could use drugs. And I like shot back. I was like, in the court case there's evidence that this type of use of peyote actually helps reduce alcoholism and other type of drug use, which is why they were doing it as like in relation to their job at this treatment center. So that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. You kind of got twisted and turned what it was actually about. um, but basically, it kind of represents a step backwards in our religious freedom legal landscape because before that time, you could say, hey, this law burns my religious freedom. And the government would have to prove that, if it did burden it, it was narrowly tailored, it was a compelling interest. Like they had to prove that they really had a reason for doing it, in short. And then this case came along, and Scalia, who's the Supreme Court justice, who's notoriously anti-drug, said, actually, this drug law is neutral and generally applicable. It applies to everyone. And so you can't just have religious communities walking around and saying, oh, well, any law that applies to everyone, like I want an exception from, which is kind of BS. Anyway, so that was the case. And in reaction to that, there was a federal law passed, actually, almost unanimously, a huge bipartisan effort. A lot of religious scholars, people had nothing to do with drugs. There was a huge like outrage, and they passed a federal piece of legislation, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and then there was a Supreme Court case a few years later that said that that law doesn't apply to the states. So right now there's this legal gray area where if like in Colorado there was that rabbi who got in trouble, there's no state RFRA in Colorado, so he kind of had limited choices for his defense, but they actually dropped his charges. But so
What did
that's
he get
one.
charged with? I'm not familiar with that.
No, it's okay. It's okay. He's a mushroom church, mushroom synagogue,
Oh,
mushroom
cool.
rabbi. I think he
Awesome.
got charged with like possession and maybe intent to sell, but they dropped all the charges because there's that law that passed Colorado. Sorry for assuming you knew about that. It's funny. I'm like really in the world, so you're like all these cases and examples popping up. But I would say the other case, the other big case that I read as an undergrad and was like, wow, there's an area here for a lawyer who knows about religion, who knows about drugs. Was in 2006, the UDV church got a religious exemption by applying that federal law, RFRA, after their sacrament was seized. So they got a little exception from the Controlled Substances Act. And then the DEA also, by court order, was required to give another church, Santo Daime, the same exception. But otherwise, the DEA just will not give these exceptions. And yeah, this is a whole area. If you listen to my episode with Chillinois, we go deep into this area. It's an area I'm reading and writing a lot about, so
Well, I
I
want to
could keep
do that
talking.
maybe a little bit, because I've seen this before. I don't want to call it drug churches because I don't really count mushrooms as drugs, but especially as a tax attorney, people were looking for nonprofit. Like you could set up. I don't know. I feel like I read about this or saw it on John Oliver. Maybe we said as long as you have like 10 people that aren't related to you and you have some kind of like I don't know commandments or something. I'm sure you know how that works, and I'd love to hear about it.
Well, the general idea is that churches, like you might hear on John Oliver and you might hear whatever, like people say like, oh, churches have no oversight. There definitely is difficult for the government to have oversight over churches, because the First Amendment. And because of that, and sort of because the First Amendment, which is you have a right to practice your religion freely, and you can't have any government establishment of religion. That's part of the First Amendment. The religion clauses. Religions are exempt from a lot of like rules and requirements and taxes. The idea behind the tax exemption, people kind of get this messed up. They're like, oh, churches don't have to pay taxes. You actually don't want your churches paying taxes, because if churches are paying taxes, then religion's controlling government, right? Like then it's like, oh, well, we pay tax money, so you should be ruling in accordance with our religion. That's like the history of it, which I actually think is pretty like makes sense to me. So because of that, churches are not actually required to file with the IRS to be a 501(c)(3). Churches, by matter of existing, as long as you have like what you're saying, enough people, you have a doctrine, like I could argue to death why the IRS and the courts' ideas around religion are pretty antiquated. They're based on Western religions, they're based on Christianity, but a lot of religions can kind of fit their way within that framework, and be, I would say, legally defensible. But the idea is like, in the secular religion world, there are some lawyers and people that talk about this, um, what they call a 508c1a, which is the section of the tax code that says that churches don't have to file. But from the perspective of the IRS and the courts, you're still subject to the same rules as a 501(c)(3), which is a tax exempt nonprofit. So, they could investigate you, they could charge back taxes and penalties. Some of the work that I'm doing with clients is like just helping, try and have them comply with the tax laws, because the government doesn't really, it seems at this point, and it's been happening from New York to Colorado to California, the government isn't showing, even in Florida, is not showing an appetite for going after psychedelic churches on the basis of religion. It's just like not a strong political argument, but they are willing to go after people for tax evasion. So if you're like paying employees, and you're not, giving them their cut, then that could be reason to go after a church. Yeah, but right now it's kind of a bottleneck. Like this is why I'm writing some like legal scholarship about this, and some other trying to write articles, like to do what I can to kind of tell the story of these communities. When I was at Georgetown last year, I did a big research project where I collected information about the churches, from just as many people as I could connect with. How are they approaching their corporate status? How are they thinking about their, religious defense? And they don't really have a lot of choices, these communities, because the DEA won't really listen to them. Like you can apply to the DEA, and the DEA says you have to stop what you're doing. You have to tell them everything about what you're doing illegally, and they can't guarantee any protection at all. And they literally have never answered. The only time they answered was SoulQuest sued them multiple times in order to get them to answer, and then they denied SoulQuest, which is a church in Florida. They denied their exemption, so they're in a really bad place. I think. Like, well, it's interesting in terms of like legal protection, in a bad place. In terms of legal enforcement, like there's not a lot of like I said, appetite to go after these churches.
Sure.
But
It seems like a
I think
bad
it's,
move. It's like
yeah, it's
you're
just
just
like,
asking for a lawsuit.
well, right. Well, and it's like the government's going to spend money trying to argue, and they don't want to create bad precedent. Like, but I don't know what I'm trying to think about with other lawyers. I'm pretty active in the Psychedelic Bar Association, so through there's like a lot of lawyers serving churches, and also just the communities that I'm working with. How can we develop some kind of strategy to really like push the whole landscape forward? So one thing I've talked about is like if you are a 501(c)(3), you should be able to get DEA exemption. Like you shouldn't have to apply to multiple government agencies. You should be able to say, the IRS thinks I'm a church, I get a DEA exemption. But the DEA exemption is pretty bad, honestly, because it requires that a church comply with the same requirements as like a medical researcher. So that means like, being tracking and storage of your sacrament in a certain way, allowing the DEA to come like investigate you. It's the same thing we are kind of just talking about with cannabis. Like, what is the right amount of regulation? But with religious freedom, with churches, I think that amount is even less. It's like, what is the bare minimum amount of regulation that would just help keep churches and communities safer? And not have too much oversight. I don't want anyone in the government saying, "Oh, you're not a real religion." Like it should be, the government should be in the position of saying, "Oh, you're committing fraud. You're using," they should have to prove that, you're doing commercial sales. They shouldn't be the one saying, "Oh, you're a religion, you're not a religion." But I mean, it's an ongoing issue, really. It's
It
because
is.
it's increasing all the time, like more and more churches.
How many of
Um,
these churches would you say there are in the country?
I mean, hundreds
Yeah.
at least. I mean, like in my research, I found like dozens that are like above ground. I mean, like they have a website, they have corporate filings, they have social media. You can like Google them, right? And that's like dozens of above ground. And then you're like, okay, well, there's so many more that are beyond that, and more forming all the time. Now how many of those like it's hard to tell. Like to me, like when I think about what a religion is, I base it off my own experience as like a member of a more traditional religion. And so we have a community and we have, like worship services and we have education events and we have some events where we use wine, and some events where we don't. And like the legal framework right now in most areas of the country, such that the government kind of expects that the sacrament is central to your religion in order for the burden from the government to be substantial enough. Which the point is, like, a lot of these churches are more like, oh, we just hold ceremonies and charge for our ceremonies. There are some churches that are more like what, like, we are a community of people and we have like regular meetings. And occasionally we have events that include use of sacrament. And I don't know where that line is going to be long term. And it's going to happen with cannabis too, where like at a certain point, hopefully, these licenses are so overinflated, but you should be able to have a church that has a cannabis garden that brings their product to a farmer's market. Now the question is like, what taxes do they have to pay?
Right. And
What
that's what I was going to
regulation?
say, that like, so I know a lot of people are pissed about the 280E stuff. And I feel like there's going to be some people trying to do that. Start a church for weed, and then you can be exempt from these ridiculous taxes. Would you mind telling people a little bit about the 280E stuff? I'm sure you probably have dealt
Yeah,
with that
sure.
once or twice.
Yeah, sure, sure. And then I could touch on the nonprofit
Yeah,
dispensary
please.
thing because yeah.
I'm
So
trying to tie it
280E,
all together here. There's a
yeah, no,
lot of
no, it's good. It's a lot. It's a lot. And I
yeah.
touch on a lot of areas and I myself am always trying to figure out, yeah, how to bring it all together. But I think the best way to talk about 280E, right, is like normal people, like when you have a business that's not cannabis, that's not dealing or, trafficking in what the government sees as trafficking in illegal drugs, which includes like state sales of cannabis. That's legal under state law. When you have a normal business, you're making money, hopefully, and you're reinvesting that money. And you could also take out credit. You could do this without making money. But the idea is you're spending money, investing in the business. You're doing things like you're paying your rent, you're paying your employees. It's money you might be making from selling your product or your services, but it's being used to run the business. These are ordinary and necessary business expenses. These are things that you can deduct because you didn't actually make that money. You really spent that money on the business, making the business grow. But for cannabis businesses, you can't deduct that, except for cost of goods sold, and that's like there's a constitutional reason behind that. I mean, the whole thing is there are a lot of people that argue it's unconstitutional. It's at the very least like nonsensical. It totally suffocates. Like so, the idea is like they call it phantom income. So you're being charged income tax on income that you don't have because you spent that money running your business, paying your rent, paying your employee salary. Especially retail gets hit the hardest on this because the cost of goods sold is just what did I buy the goods from, and everything else you can't. But if you're like a cultivator, then you can argue that a lot of the costs, are wrapped up with the like cultivating, processing, trimming, like a lot of that could, be contributing to the development of your inventory, which is your cost of goods sold. Um, your actual like, yeah, good development. So 280E is a huge issue. It's also going to be a huge issue for psilocybin out in Oregon. And whatever happens in Colorado, the Colorado law has no taxes in it at all. I don't know what's going to happen with that. Colorado just passed a law a few weeks ago that like will start creating a process. It has a decrim aspect and a legal aspect for like I think I want to say it's like Iowa, like DMT, psilocybin, peyote. I should remember exactly what drugs it is now that I'm saying this out
I
loud.
won't I
But
won't hold that one against you. That's
yeah,
a
it's
lot of
okay. It's
shit.
okay. It's okay. It's a lot of shit. But the point is there's four psychedelics that are naturally occurring that will be beginning to become legal in Colorado in the next few years without clear guidance on the tax implications for the people that will be selling them, which is huge. Because like we see what you're saying in cannabis, like this is really the difference for a lot of cannabis businesses on actually making any money at all. And the biggest cannabis businesses are not paying these taxes. I saw some articles recently, which is just a sign of the times, that for a lot of the super big cannabis businesses, when they're looking at the amount of money that they owe the IRS, including the penalties that they owe because they're late, the percentage of interest that they're looking at on those, they're sort of like weighing that. That's just like a cost. It's like, what is the interest rate on this loan that we're getting from the IRS, which is money that we owe them? Because it's cheaper to owe money to the IRS than it is to like take out a loan right now because the interest rates are so high. so, so it's kind of like that's how bad it is. We're like but the IRS can come in at any moment and say, look, we're not going to sit around and wait for our money anymore. So I think
There's
that
a
actually
lot of debt. There's a lot of
it's
fucking
a
debt.
lot of debt.
The top
I mean,
30 MSOs, I thought I was looking at like $500 million. That's crazy.
I mean, it's a lot. And one thing is like, so the government says, oh, well, 280E, like, is a an easy enforcement return. The IRS loves to audit cannabis businesses because they know that they're going to get money back from 280E. But if the companies can't pay, then maybe that could hopefully like help convey. I don't know. That's one of the things with federal legalization is like we want to make up for 280E, but like right now, they're not getting like the government's view. We don't want to legalize and lose out on all this tax money. But right now, they're not even really getting the tax money. Um, but on the nonprofit side, so New York actually just licensed a bunch of nonprofits that were going to own dispensaries. So there's some interesting potential 280E planning there. But I think like I mean, it depends how much you can put in a subsidiary. Like, and the money coming back up to the nonprofit will be tax exempt, but it's just like the 280E is still going to apply to like a for-profit subsidiary of a nonprofit. But I think when it comes to like the churches or when it comes to, the world as I think it should be and as I hope it will be within my career, like you should be able to have a nonprofit whose charitable purpose is cultivating affordable cannabis for people who
Mhm,
need it.
mhm,
Um, and like that's tax exempt. And whether or not that can happen before 280E, and 280E would go away if cannabis was descheduled. So this applies to Schedule 1 and 2. 280E does. So if it were rescheduled to Schedule 3, that would also help with the 280E, but that would cause a whole bunch of other problems. So I think descheduling would solve the 280E problem.
Yeah, I'm not
So
a
it's
I'm
it's
not a rescheduling fan.
no.
Uh, boy, you got a lot of information in there.
Yeah,
You
I
burned
know,
my
I know.
brain
And
a little
now
bit
I'm annoyed that I can't remember. It's funny. You're like, you just told me so much. I'm like, I want to know what the drugs are
there.
um in the Natural Medicine Health Act. It's hard to keep up with all this stuff.
It
The
is.
big,
It's a ton of information. It comes at you really fast.
yeah, sorry if I was fast, but you can, so
No, no.
the
I go back and watch later. I will
okay,
forget
cool.
a lot of the stuff that I talk about. I'm focused. I'm like trying to look at my notes and make sure I'm
Yeah,
paying
yeah, yeah,
attention. But
yeah.
it's
Well,
I
the
that's why I
Colorado,
record it.
I pulled it up and just so I can make sure I can correct my error. So it
Oh,
is
nice.
DMT, ibogaine, mescaline, but it's excluding peyote. I knew when I said peyote, it's not. It's not. It's mescaline excluding peyote and psilocybin. But it's going to include only psilocybin and psilocin until 2026. But the law in Colorado creates then that framework, which they can add those other drugs, DMT, ibogaine, and mescaline. So it's pretty a good. I mean, it's funny to me because I'm like, I think MDMA and like acid are great, but these are like DMT is intense, right? I mean, they're all good and they're all good in their own time. And yeah, I don't know. I was at this event in California, the Emerald Cup, and they had some speakers there, and they said something that just reminded me of how like silly this whole drug movement is. Silly is not the right word, but like this bill in Colorado which passed, which is super great and exciting. Like it's good, right? Like it's good that these psychedelics are going to be, less criminal and maybe more regulated and more accessible. Uh, but if they really wanted to help people, they would have like decriminalized like meth or like um,
I'm with it.
or like
Yeah, decriminalize everything.
cocaine. Yeah,
Really.
like things that people are actually getting enforced against, right? Like all over the country. It's like there's this focus on psychedelics and cannabis, but enforcement rates are much higher for other illegal drugs.
Um, what do we got? Safe banking. Have you read through the Safe Banking Act?
I
The
read
sec-
through it like, maybe when people thought it was like a good bill like 5 years ago.
oh,
I haven't
really?
read it. No,
Well,
I mean I haven't read.
I just read the new one, and I got to say, I was I don't know. I've seen a lot of people. There's two camps on the internet. There's these guys saying we need this to it's going to help the small businesses and it's going to give them access to these financial services. And then obviously the other people who read it, I think, don't see it that way. And really, what as I read, the first sentence is um, to create protections for financial institutions. So that argument,
Yeah.
like about it's going to help the small guys, I'm like, all right, well, let's read the first sentence first because that's usually the important part. And really, I didn't see protection for small businesses. I saw protection for banks and insurance companies and people like who lease you real estate. They all got like full protection from civil asset forfeiture, criminal, administrative, um, And little guys, basically, they said, well, look, now it's not now the money you're carrying will not be considered the proceeds of a illegal drug transaction or whatever. Um, and then they said, well, and you can have a place to park your money in the bank. But as you said earlier, the feds have already said they're not going to or aggressively chase these cases in states with legal markets. So it's kind of already like it's not illegal. So there goes kind of half of the first provision. That was like a nothing burger. And then they're like, oh, well, you could park your money in a bank because you got all this cash. But as soon as they make it federally legal, then the credit card companies will come in and you won't have the pile of cash. I bet that you'll have 20% of the cash. And all these guys have safes built into their places where they could just stash a little cash. So it seemed like nothing. And meanwhile, like full protection from any kind of liability for banks and the same. I just I didn't Federal Reserve banks, federal home loan banks look like they're going to be getting in on the action too. And boy, you got any thoughts on that rant?
Yeah, well, I think it's funny because like for the people, and I'm not saying you're one of these people, you're like in response to those people, but for people that are like, we need to pass safe banking, let's get the stock price up, invest in cannabis, change is coming, the feds care. Like, safe banking is a hot topic right now. For me, who doesn't think it has any chance of passing and wouldn't do anything to help any of the businesses that I care about, like, I'll read it if it passes, right? Like, I'm not even going to waste my energy on it right now. Like, I think my energy right now is spent on keeping up with things that I think could actually help small businesses. So, like, there was a federal law, to your point earlier, that was introduced called the SHIP Act, which would potentially, if there was descheduling, create direct to consumer sales. There was a state bill passed in California. I think earlier this fall, it was signed by the governor Newsom. That would open the door. There is a process right now, in motion right now for either the AG of California to give an opinion or the AG of California, Attorney General, to put pressure on the DOJ to give guidance for interstate commerce between consenting states. And New Jersey introduced a bill like that. I think New England places should be thinking about that kind of like, state-led interstate commerce. Fuck the feds. Sorry to be like, it's like they're not doing anything. They pretty much, there was like some legal scholars out there that were like, we need to give Congress time to figure out what they want to do. And it's like they've already figured it out. They don't want to do anything.
I thought
They
that was
literally want to
pretty.
sit.
Sorry to cut you off, but I thought that was
No,
pretty fucking obvious by now. Like,
right. So like I'm like, let's figure out ways to get, the feds out of the way and let the states keep doing what they're doing, and do it well. And I've been kind of following as like a pet project, nerd project before it was like as cool as it is now, the Dormant Commerce Clause litigation,
I saw
which
that.
now is like,
Yeah,
yeah, it's like making waves now, like with New York, and then there was a case filed in Oregon, and there was one filed in LA where people are challenging these limitations on interstate commerce because they are unconstitutional. And so people are challenging them because there was a case in Maine that was decided in August where a federal circuit court said, look, this is an interstate market. The feds have basically, by collecting taxes, by passing the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment saying they're not going to enforce against state markets, that's Congress saying we know there's interstate markets and we're okay with it. And so the court like applied constitutional principles to invalidate residency requirements in Maine medical. And that right now there's an ongoing lawsuit in New York about this. And so I think those to me are more pressing, interesting, impactful issues in like the on the ground cannabis market. And like safe banking is like investor fodder. And like advocates who are
it
responding to that.
is.
I'm not saying like you shouldn't respond to it. Like it's worth, I'm glad you read it. Like I said, if it passes, I'll read it. I remember reading it last year and there's been ongoing back and forth. And there are advocate groups, like there's a great paper put out, I think through Ohio State Drug Enforcement Policy Center with like Shalene Title. And I think like Kat Parker. It's like a bunch of like regulators and policy experts who are writing about like the truth about safe banking and what it would actually need in it for it to do anything similar to what people are saying it could do to actually help people. So that was my rant to your rant. Cheers.
Yeah, when I just I've talked to a lot of small businesses here in Vermont, like a lot of them. I haven't heard a single one of them talking about safe banking, So it's like, okay, if all these small people need this help, like why aren't they begging for it? Like surely they would have heard about this and been like, oh yeah, we need that. That's just not happening the way I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I see more people are getting behind the SHIP Act, and I think like
That was a
there's
good idea.
and they're trying to, and like, look, I have a lot of questions on implementation of that. And it relates kind of to this dormant commerce clause. Like, the idea behind our government and our system of states is like we're supposed to have a fair national marketplace. And there's an ongoing tension of like when is the Congress supposed to regulate versus what is left to the states to regulate. And like what happens, like there's a literally Supreme Court case that was heard a few months ago on the issue of like can California pass a law that says like if you want to sell pork in our state, you have to treat it a certain way. Is that interstate issue or is that a state issue? And the state of California is saying, we're talking about selling pork in our state. This is a state issue. And the pork industry is saying, hey, this impacts our storage of pork all over the country. This is a federal issue. You can't just let California come in and impose its views on us. It's like the California labeling, like the cancer labeling. You see that on products all over the country
It's
because
one on the
California
box under my computer right here.
yeah, California requires it, and producers say California is such a big economy that it makes more economic sense for us to label all of our products that way, for us to treat all of our pork that way, and eventually, to grow all of our cannabis that way, or to store all of our cannabis that way, like these same principles. And like California has outsized power because of the size of its economy. But like to me, that's okay. I mean, it can be good and bad when you look at like how California regulates, and for what reasons, and whether, and like one of the debates, and I think you'd see a similar debate like with cannabis, where it's like, is the treatment of pork about like a health concern, or is it about some ethical or moral concern? Like, do you want your cannabis to be have to be grown organically because you think it's better for patients, or are you like just trying to impose some like moral high ground on people? So these are going to be real and ongoing issues, but once you can grow cannabis in every state and then sell it in whatever state, I think the market will look a lot different, because it just doesn't make sense to grow cannabis everywhere in mass. But I do hope you'll still have like, in mass meaning like not the state, like
No, I
the
feel you.
yeah, yeah. No, no, no. Since I said that though, I'm always mindful in New England. I'm like not in mass, like en mass. But I still think there's space for small craft growers everywhere. It's just like the big guys. Like you don't need like, big MSO crap weed grown in Missouri. Like you just don't. You're gonna
That's what
have
I
it. Don't worry.
I mean, and that's what I've been saying about the Vermont market because all five of our medical licenses were bought up by, Curaleaf got a couple, Iantis got one, and Slang Worldwide, they got the other two. And it's like there's plenty of good weed growers. And that's the other thing. Most of these places don't even fucking grow good weed. If one of them could turn out some fire, boy, might be able to overlook some of the other shit. But I don't see any good weed coming out of these places, especially the medical places. They were selling moldy. I've got at least like 5 or 6 people on the record here just talking about moldy weed for $400 an ounce coming out of these medical dispensaries. And personally, I thought, boy, that's bordering on fucking criminal right there. It's ridiculous. And honestly, I think if you're gonna grow weed in a medical dispensary, you should have to have some kind of, like, they don't let people go into the Oxycontin factory and make Oxycontin unless they like went to Oxycontin school or something. You know what I'm saying? And I think they should have something like that for weed because some of the people I see growing at these medical places, they have no experience. And the products that come out could be super, you got people with breathing problems and you're giving them moldy weed, that could be a big problem.
Yeah, I know it's a big problem in Oklahoma. I mean, it's a big problem. A lot of like, what's the thing? Like, not everywhere is a good place to grow, and also like like especially New England is tough with mold, with like the wet fall. Like, I'm not saying like an outdoor. I mean, you really need to be paying attention to what you're doing and prioritizing quality, and it's easy for that to go to the wayside when consumers don't know better. But I do think that like I am interested in Vermont's market a lot. Like as a lawyer, I've thought about, and I still have some time because the way lawyer works, at least for most states, is you take a test. Like I took a test in New York and I passed it with a high enough score where I could become a lawyer in like 40 some states. I had to do another test for California, which was a pain, but for the reasons we just talked about, California is a huge economy, huge psychedelic economy. It felt worth it. It feels worth it, to be able to work there. But like Vermont is on that list where I'm like, well, maybe it'd be worth it for me to explore getting licensed in Vermont because the market I think is really actually unique in terms of the national marketplace. Like a lot of big investors would look at Vermont and be like, I don't want to invest in Vermont. Like, first of all, it's a small state. Second of all, like, it's very like, like people like, I think other people from Vermont, like other people from Vermont want to support, just like kind of Rhode Island is like that. Like we're, like a community oriented, Rhode Island oriented state. But also they're not hyper competitive licenses, at least this round. They're more affordable. They're smaller licenses. They like, as someone who's like talked to some people who are looking at getting licenses in Vermont, like who are Vermont people who have just asked my opinion. as a non-lawyer, since I'm not licensed there, when I look at the application and I look at it is way more accessible, and I think possible for people to get a license in Vermont than in many other states. And that's encouraging to me. As just like when I look at even like Rhode Island's licenses, like Rhode Island has a moratorium on cultivation licenses for another few years. And they haven't even appointed their like commission that's going to be implementing the law that they signed last year. So they're moving way slower. I don't know. Maybe that's just my outsider view of Vermont. Like I know there's a lot of problems on the inside, but there also are a lot of really smart and strong like advocates and cultivators in Vermont. So I look at that as like a really positive, like
Mm,
people who are really engaged and who know what they're talking about. And I've smoked some really good weed grown in Vermont.
mm. Absolutely, we've got some great growers. I think it's maybe though a bit of yeah, it's cheaper, it's more affordable here. The licenses are cheaper, yeah. But people are broke here. Like
Yeah.
honestly, I if I
Mm,
I can afford a fucking background check right now. Um,
mm,
and so the social equity was whatever. Like they waive your license and application fee for the first year and then phase it back in over 3 years. But if you that's really the smallest cost. If you don't have a business set up already or a space to grow or a farm, like where you can grow outside, um, boy, it's going to be a lot of overhead. If you want to start an indoor cultivation facility, that's a lot of overhead. Outdoor, you could do for cheaper, but then you have to have your own land. Good luck fucking getting land up here right now. It's just through the roof. So I
mm.
think that kind of, yeah, it is cheaper, but people are so broke here. So that kind of scales with it, I think. Um, and it's
No,
tricky,
that's a
man.
fair point.
And people just don't have
That's
that kind of money in the bank. Like even like I don't know, retail. I feel like was fairly cheap. You got a social equity and they waived that, and you had a storefront where you're ready to go. Like I guess you could set that up but that's still you're probably looking at like I don't know, 100 grand. I don't know. Some of the ones I've seen minimum. And boy, I just don't know that many people up here who have that kind of money kicking around, and
yeah.
you can't get loans.
Yeah,
So
yeah. No, I think that's really a good like I said, I'm not from there, so it's an outsider view. And
yeah, yeah.
so I think that's like helpful context too. And like some people I've talked to, they already have a farm, or like people were in hemp already. So they're like transitioning. And so some of that like gives you that more flexibility. But I guess I think about it compared to New York. Like, well, cost of living is such an interesting like thing because it's like, well, if salaries are higher, it's like, well, what is the ratio of like cost of living and income to
Right.
cost of
That number in a
license?
vacuum doesn't really show you anything. You need to.
Right. And like, but in New York, like the licensing, like everything from what is the cost of a med dispensary to go adult use to like what is going to be the cost of getting a license and securing the land to get the license and like all of that. Like to me, like Massachusetts and New York are just so much more. But like to your point, like even compared to Rhode Island too, the salaries are lower here, the cost of living is lower here, but like the employment rates are lower here. Um, I don't know. I heard it Maine, excuse me, because of that lawsuit, which invalidated the med requirements. I've heard I need to like it's funny as a lawyer, you probably shouldn't say like I heard something, but I mean I want to look more into it, but just that, like you can get a Maine cultivator license without being like a Maine caregiver license without being a Maine resident. But
Oh
my
yeah, they did.
curiosity,
Yeah,
allegedly,
they did lift that. There was a residency requirement, and the
that they
state
lifted.
overturned it. And
Right. So then the question is like, do you have to be cultivating in Maine?
hmm,
Like, I don't know. Like, could you just like buy that license and then cultivate in another state? Like, I don't know. But I think that's like where we're headed,
that's a good
where like
question.
you should be able to just like it, well, there's gonna have to be, and there already are starting to be some organization amongst state regulators in terms of consistency and regulation amongst different states that are neighboring. So that way, like I know there are brands, companies that have businesses in multiple states. I mean, the MSOs are one piece, but I even think there's like a brand out here like Betty's Eddies, like which happens to be an edible company that I like. But they sell like in Rhode Island dispensaries and they sell in Mass dispensaries, and they're the same product, but they have different labeling requirements and different dosaging requirements because the med in Rhode Island can be 10 and the adult use in
Oh
Mass is
right.
5 milligram, whatever. So I appreciate that they have like, and that they must have two separate state entities and licenses, and they're like, however, they're working their way through. But like they should be able to just like make their product and sell it in all the states in the area, just like any other producer. um, of
Sure.
like anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we,
And I
I
think we're
think,
headed there. I really think we're headed there. Like all the pressure that's being put, and yeah, this is like safe banking is like over here, but all the action is like what we're talking about. Like, how do we help people? Because the thing is, people are not waiting. Like, I know you probably know people like this too. I know amazing cultivators and hash makers and whatever in the Northeast, and they are bringing their products to New York, right? Like, and selling them like way up price in these illegal dispensaries in New York City. And you can pay $70 for an eighth in New York City, which is insane to me. I mean, that's like what I mean, that's like mass. Some of it's like that, like the Maine, well,
Mhm.
Maine is a whole other market because of the price undercutting, but
Yeah.
Jersey's like that, like where you can still really get. And then when I was out in California last week, like the best weed I've ever smoked, like 20 an eighth. You're like, this is
Yeah. Right.
so there's something wrong here, but I think yeah, the market's demanding change. So hopefully the laws catch up.
How long can I keep you here, Victoria?
A few more minutes. I don't know. Like I'm mindful, like I don't know how long your episode like do you cut this stuff up? Or you
Honestly,
just
no, I do the whole thing. I could keep this could be 3 hours. But
yeah, I mean I don't have 3 hours. I do
yeah.
got some work to do, like
Okay.
yeah, I'm my own boss these days, which is awesome, but I'm an asshole to me, so I gotta work.
Okay. Let me hit a couple. I'm curious about how these companies are allowed to get their get listed on publicly traded like do you know about
Psychedelic.
no like the MSOs. I see they're all being traded like I'm like okay, we got a federally legal product here, but you're trading stocks. How does that work?
Yeah, so that's like I can tell you what I know, knowing that this is not my area really of expertise or knowledge, but for my understanding, a lot of the US based cannabis companies, they have a Canadian company that either owns them, enlists them,
Right.
or because it's federally legal in Canada.
So,
So I
so
think
it's
a
because
lot of
they
that,
fucking headquartered up there.
yeah. Like I know Canopy, I think, is like a Canada based company, Canopy Growth, like a
Most of
big
them are, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Purely like
And I mean, I think the
science.
other thing is like when I think about like weed maps, or I think Dutchy might be publicly traded. I don't remember. Like those are not plant touching, in the same
Right.
way. So I think that's one of the workarounds. On the psychedelic side, it's a whole thing where people like went into Canada and like I forget the language. There's a term to describe this thing where like you'll basically take over a shell company that's already being listed and then that becomes like your company. So you just like take over their like I don't even know how that's legal. I'm like, that's crazy. But these mining companies, literally these Canadian mining companies have been a really popular choice for psychedelics. Like, and it's funny because I mean the critiques are valid. There's some people who are critiquing this as sort of like the whole idea is resource extraction. That's the similarity between the psychedelic companies and the mining companies. Like, how do we exploit and extract resources from other people?
Hmm.
It's messed up.
Hmm. Okay, let's see. I also wanted to touch DUI laws. How do you feel
Hmm.
about well, I see they're going to do, the standard alcohol field sobriety tests on people. Basically, they're training drug recognition experts. Um, any thoughts on the DUI laws here for as they pertain to cannabis? I mean, you obviously
Yeah,
probably shouldn't be eating acid and driving a car. That one seems pretty
yeah,
cut and dry. But cannabis
yeah,
seems like it doesn't seem like they've proven that it's dangerous to drive when you're high.
yeah. And I think like, well, one thing I will say on the like literally, if we're talking about law, we got to really change these laws. Like, I'm pretty sure even in the state where I live, Rhode Island, like, it's if they wanted to, like I don't even think I have an affirmative defense. I think if I were driving poorly and they pulled me over and they decided to drug test me and I had THC in my system, which it would be in my system even if I hadn't consumed that day. Like I've been smoking pot every day for like a
Yeah,
decade.
yeah,
Like it is in my system.
yeah,
And like I could get a DUI for that. So like that, there should be an affirmative defense. Some states are starting to pass laws. I think maybe Indiana or somewhere, like which is surprising, has this like affirmative defense for like medical patients, whatever. Look, in terms of like the impact, like people are like, oh, we're gonna legalize and we're gonna have an increase, and I'm scared of the driving. It's like that has never been a reason to not like keep alcohol legal. And alcohol is way more dangerous. And the same mindset of like we trust people, maybe we shouldn't, but we do trust people to be their own judgment of whether or not they can drive after consuming something that will impair their driving. Now, whether or not cannabis impairs my driving or anyone's driving is like I think a personal thing personally. You know, as a patient that utilizes cannabis, you know, I'm not like, oh, let me rip bong and then go behind the wheel, but like, do I think that the general impact on my mood and like demeanor is positive when I'm driving? Yes. Like, do I think like it lessens my road rage? Like, yes. Like, does it make me like want to be a more careful driver because I know that there are legal risks associated with driving while impaired? Like, yes. But yeah, it pisses me off. I literally had some conversation with this one last night. They're like, I'm afraid of the driving. And this person is like, you know, inebriated on alcohol and about to drive. And it's like, well, you know, what's the double standard?
I'm
And I,
afraid of old people. They kill a lot of people in car in Vermont. Old people have on in like 4 of the last 7 years, I think, killed more people than drunk drivers. So should we make being
and
old?
tire drivers.
Sure, maybe we should ban old people from driving. No,
Well, yeah, it's,
it just seems
I
like
don't know.
another
And
way for cops to fuck with people, and I hate that. All I wanted from legalization was for cops to go away and leave me alone. And now we've given them another reason to pull you out of the car.
yeah, I mean, look, I think the benefit is that you can't literally just, and at least like I know the New York law and like in general as and I'm not saying that people don't find reasons, but even people I know that have gotten in trouble for like having drugs in their car, they get pulled over because they have like a expired registration, right?
Yeah,
Or they had like a headlamp out, like something like that. So like look, like they can't just pull you over because you look like someone who might have pot in your car. Like there needs
but
to be, oh, I mean, look.
they
In terms
can.
of like legal basis,
Yeah, sure.
do they pull over people of color? Or like, look, if they saw me driving a car that had a headlight out and someone else drive a car that had a headlight out or whatever, would they like use their discretion and more likely pull off someone that doesn't look like me? Like, yes. And then would they be more likely to assume that person has drugs and ask them to get out? And like is racism still a part of our legal system? 100%. But there are like things that you can do as someone who's taking other legal risks, like, you know, make sure your car registration is, make sure you're like, but look, people make mistakes. Like, don't speed. Like I'm queen of like I'm gonna go 8 over the speed limit and not a sink like or 5 like you know. And look, knock on wood, I'm saying all this. I'm about to go on like a road trip unless this winter storm destroys my plan. But you know, it's trying to reduce risks, just like everything else that we're doing. But yeah, I think it's like, oh well, if I'm like, look at Colorado, like they legalized pot. Is there more car accidents?
There
No,
actually
like
no. You know what? I read a study that Vermont
that there were
Department of Health
less.
loves to quote. No, there is more. There was a spike in car accidents, but they were also giving away um, to go cocktails during the COVID years was when they did the study, and they said,
That
"Oh,
was
there is a spike." And then actually, right under that at the end, there's a little asterisk, and it says there was our hypothesis was not proven, and there was no causal link found between cannabis legalization and the spike in car accidents. And the state leaves that part out, which drives me nuts, dude. It's like if you're gonna quote a study, quote the whole fucking thing. Don't cherry
mm,
pick your stats. That's more fear porn right there. And it's giving cops this ability to, to fuck with people. And it's a bit of misinformation, I'd say, or an intentional omission, which, sometimes I think is worse than lying.
yeah.
That one really kills
Yeah,
me.
it's just crazy as someone who like does drugs that are less popular and like look, alcohol, it's like wild to me because I just don't enjoy drinking. I literally just like don't I mean like I've drank in my life. I went through like a college phase of drinking. But the amount of like normalization of not just like, oh, alcohol is bad for me. Alcohol is something that our culture like other people acknowledge this. Alcohol is something that our culture like organizes itself around. Alcohol makes me feel so bad the next day that I literally like, you know, don't. Other people say this. I don't want to, or I plan for it. Oh, I'm gonna go out and drink tonight, knowing I'm going to feel like I want to die tomorrow, and that it's worth it, right? And then let's like, oh, alcohol, like all these things that people just are like, oh yeah, that's totally normal. And then it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna smoke pot. Pot's gonna make you crazy. It's like, where is this coming from?
Yeah.
Like just the amount of propaganda and misinformation that people just like accept as true. And then I also, and this is like, this might be one of the most controversial things I say on here. It's like alcohol really makes people, it kills brain cells. It literally makes you stupid. Like that's like scientific. It causes cancer. It causes people to get sick. And not just like alcoholism and liver just, I mean, it actually harms your ability to think and think clearly and to process information. And so like maybe that's also why there's like these people that are so like love alcohol, drink every night, and then when it's like, oh, like I had this interaction with someone else where they're like, oh, I wouldn't want cannabis stores in my city. Like all the people that go there, I'm like, you mean me? Like it's like this, like you bought into this propaganda while she's like chugging wine. It's like, why are your drugs okay? And because you've been told my drugs are bad. Like, I don't know. It's yeah,
They were
clearly I
kind of the
get
guinea
frustrated
pigs.
by it.
They were kind of the guinea pigs for the propaganda models, the reefer madness era, which, in a way, I guess that kind of makes them a victim too, But honestly, I get so sick of dealing with these people. Like I've tried to talk to a lot of people, like, and some people are just those prohibitionists are so unreasonable. So it's like I want to have an open conversation with you, but you're just not willing to accept any fucking new ideas here. So it's like I guess we got to just wait for you guys to die off or something.
Or like I said, live by example, which this like blows people like, and I have to fight this. I had to fight this all through school. And thankfully, like I personally myself didn't fight this within very long because I was like, weed is literally helping me be a better person. I'm not like fighting my own, like at the beginning, there's like cognitive dissonance, like, well, if this is illegal and people are in jail for it, it must be bad. So how can I like it? And like, should I be, and then I reached a point like, look, this is literally helping me live my life. And then like it helped me like graduate law school with honors and like pass 2 bar exams, including like the hardest ones in the country, and go get a tax law degree, which is like notoriously difficult, and graduate with honors from one of the top programs in the country. So then when people come to me and they're like, oh, weed makes you stupid. I'm like, who are you calling stupid? Because like by every metric of society's idea of what makes
Yep.
someone smart, I'm extremely accomplished and
Yeah.
smart. And
Yeah.
I'm telling you that I've used weed every
Right.
single
And
day.
you used the thing. They've never used the thing. So like, how the fuck could you really know about it? What But the way they quote a lot of these like angry parents nonprofits, the way they quote science, it really drives me nuts. Um, and it's misleading. And I think honestly that's more dangerous to kids than anything because then they're going to see you tell these kids it's so dangerous, and then they're going to see one of their friends get high and nothing will happen, and then that other kid will get high and they'll be like, huh, and then they're going to try it and they'll be like, wait, this isn't that bad. Was I just fucking lied to my whole life by everybody? Like, and then you got a real
That's the
problem on your
thing.
hands.
Yeah, that's literally what it causes. It leads to like, I don't know. There's a whole culture though. Look, from like, Santa Claus to whatever. Like, we lie to our kids. We don't treat our, and I'm not here to say people shouldn't do that if it makes them, and there could be a time and place for lying to your kids, I guess, but that's not really my thinking about it because that doesn't build trust and credibility. And you want people to like come to you and believe you. And yeah.
Especially your kids, right?
Right. I mean, like, I know it made me look, but I do think your point of like they're victims too. Like, thankfully, like I had people in my family who supported me, but I also had people in my family who were like, oh, like I was in, 8 years ago being like, you guys don't understand. MDMA for PTSD is gonna be the biggest thing. Like, people need to take this seriously. And they're like, you just love drugs and you're just crazy.
Yeah.
And then now I get the email like, oh, didn't you hear? Like the New York Times did a piece about it. I'm like, I wasn't making this shit up. Like, I was like just a little
I
too
I had that
yeah.
same struggle with my family, and it didn't change till I gave my grandma edibles 2 days before she died from cancer. Bang, and it
Yeah,
worked
no.
amazing. Um,
Yeah.
Let me one final note here. I saw that you gave a little shout out. You're doing some work with the Parabola Center there. I was wondering if you could just maybe tell me about that before we get out of here.
Yeah, sure. And like this has been a fun conversation. I was just like, this is, the week before the holidays. Like, I don't know, we're trying to organize, and I'm just like, I'm gonna show up and try and be myself.
Oh, don't
And
worry, I'm
it's
all over the place. So you're doing
yeah,
great. This is
it's been
fantastic.
fun.
Yeah,
Yeah, so and I also always am like, well, I don't know as much about Vermont as you know, but like that was the point, right? To learn from each
I'll
other.
be happy to share with you later.
Yeah. Parabola Center for Law and Policy is really, I think, a unique organization. I would say it's progressive. They say nonpartisan, but a drug policy think tank founded by some amazing women of color who are, have experience as regulators and lawyers. And their whole mission is to both like help prepare policy and law that would help, reflect the interests of small businesses, and equity owned businesses, and, like craft businesses, people whose voices are not currently, paying lobbyists big dollars, like big tobacco or big alcohol, and help, both create policy that reflects what is important to those kind of businesses, but also educate and help business owners be engaged in this process, the legislative process, particularly focused, I think, at the federal level, with anti-monopoly work specifically. And yeah, so they're a 501(c)(3. So as a nonprofit tax lawyer, I have gotten to help them with some work, and then also got invited to be a partner of theirs through this new program they just launched, where they started with 50 small businesses that they're going to be holding like sessions for us all to kind of work together. That their view, Shalene and who's my closest friend and ally within that organization, Shalene Title. I think that their goal is to say, okay, if we want to create policy that reflects the views of small businesses, let's like just hear from the people that are on the ground doing it, and uplift them and connect them. So it's really an honor for me to be included in that and to have the opportunity to connect with the other people that are partners. And they're looking for 50 more partners. And I think they have three guiding principles that, if you are a corporation that does I guess, does these things, then you can't be a part of this partnership program. So one of them is opposing home grow. They're not in support of anyone that opposes home grow. So a corporation that has lobbied against, like Cureleaf maybe or whoever, that they're not a part of it. I'm pulling this up because I'm like, I want to make sure I say it right. They're opposing corporations who file lawsuits against social equity. So if someone's like, we don't believe in social equity, we want to challenge social equity. I think it's important that some of these residency requirements people are saying is challenging social equity, but there are a lot of ways to do social equity that do not involve residency requirements. So those are kind of distinct. Yeah, and the last thing, which this is huge, they oppose corporations who advocate for criminal crackdowns on the legacy market. So people that have, money and investment, they're like, oh, we want to invest millions of dollars into a New York license, and we want to see the return on our investment. And like literally, there are investors who I've heard say this shit, like, we don't want to invest in that market unless they're going to crack down on the legacy market, and we need them to go out and criminalize them. And
I know the
so,
shareholders are fucking horrible people. They don't care.
and
They're selfish and greedy. A lot of
yeah,
them. Sorry, I don't mean to
no, no,
generalize it.
no, 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 no. Yeah, like I guess, look, and I'm experiencing this as like a newer lawyer, and as a just like human in the world. Like I'm very no one's going to give you anyone permission to live their values. No one's going to say, look, you can just choose to like do what you believe in. You have to like decide that that's something you care about, and decide that you're not willing to take money from people who are doing things that harm you or the people that you love. And look, or that what you believe in. Like I believe that legalization should not be prohibition 2.0, period. And like I don't want to take money from people that think that that's what legalization is about, cracking down on the people that are already operating. I think home grow is like a civil right, a human right, and like a patient right,
Oh yeah.
an equity, an an equity thing. It's like if you can't grow your own medicine, there's not really access. Even if it's hard, it's way more affordable to grow your own medicine. It's something that everyone should be able to do if they want, and have the knowledge and the law allows them to do it. But yeah, no one's going to give you that permission. And it's something I'm trying to figure out as like a lawyer. There are a lot of people I could take money from, but only way less people that I actually feel good about taking that money. And so, I'm exploring like, doing other writing, doing other teaching, having diversified sources of income so that I can maintain, a values driven legal practice and approach. So yeah, like Parabola Center doesn't take any money from like big tobacco or big MSOs. Like there's no one swaying them. They really and I don't think I appreciated that as much, until now when I'm in a more professional setting where it's like who I take money from matters because there are expectations that come with money.
Yeah.
And it's a privilege. Look, I'm privileged, very privileged, to have all kinds of resources that allow me to make these choices, but I think I owe it to myself, and like to the movement that I'm trying to support Parabola Center. So if anyone's listening to this and you have like a small business that you believe in those values, like you should check out parabolacenter.com/partners because they're taking more partners. It's a pretty small barrier to entry to join. And then, yeah, you get to help be a part of shaping this policy. Yeah, and connect with other like-minded people. And I think the idea is if we build this coalition, like, we're not alone. There's way more of us than them. They just right now have more money.
Yes, they do. They I have a feeling they always will too. If the Safe Banking Act goes through, they're just gonna have even more.
Well,
Uh,
this okay. That's the thing. Look, this is like a secret that none of these investors like want to say, and I wish this wasn't true, but it's honestly how I feel. Congress does not give a shit about cannabis. They literally don't care. Schumer doesn't care. McConnell doesn't care. Biden doesn't care. Like none
maybe
of them
they'll
care.
maybe they'll listen to you because I've been trying to tell people, but
Like they don't care. And if they're saying that they care, if they're saying that they're talking about it, it's because they're trying to get a certain number of group of people to be in support or to feel energized or to donate money or whatever. If they really cared, like Biden would have done what he did right before the election, like 2 years ago, or 4 years ago, or
Or
8 years
fucking
ago.
20 years ago. Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, you could say, oh, well, he wasn't in the Oval Office, whatever, whatever, but like, whatever. He literally does not care about pot, which is annoying when people are like, well, when do you think we're going to have federal movement? I think a decade is like a reasonable expectation within the decade. Do I think that there's going to be a big bill passed this year? No. Do I think even safe banking is going to pass? No. If it could it pass? Maybe.
Mm. And then you
But
just see
like,
the pump and dump activities on in the stock markets. They're like, oh, is it gonna pass? Oh, this guy said this thing. So like, I see people trading off of these tweets. It's
no,
like,
no, absolutely. And people are doing it for that reason, which is why I don't really pay mine. Like if I had to guess, I would say there's like a less than 5% chance of Safe Bank passing this year. Like
I thought it was
maybe
closer to zero, but
2%. Like I don't know. I don't want to say
that's
like
I'll give you two. Yeah, sure.
like but not enough for me to think about it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah. But I think yeah, I think I answered that question. You have anything
Hell
else
yeah,
for me right now? I
you did.
could
No, I'm gonna let you go. We could maybe
yeah.
do this again sometime because I feel like I could probably get another 7 hours out of you. Um, I always leave. Thank you for joining. Oh, geez, there goes my shit. Good catch. Anyway,
I
yeah.
feel you.
Thank you for joining me, Victoria. But I always leave the last word for the guest. If there's anything we left out or anything that you'd like to say, this is all you. Thank you for being here. This was fantastic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm always working to be able to express all these things I got in like all these years of school to everyone else. Because I'm not trying to, yeah, I just spent more dedicated hours reading about this, but the more that I can explain it to other people, the more it's worth it for me to have spent that time. So I really appreciate that. And I think that kind of drives like a lot of, I'm in this like weird millennial Gen Z line thing. Like I didn't used to get the generational things, but I grew up with the internet like very much, like in using computer in like kindergarten, and using social media in high school. So I am pretty active on social media and there's a lot of different views of that by other people, and I don't really care. It, for example, connected me to you. It's connected me to a lot of great opportunities, and I find that's just like a cool way to connect with people and to share what I know. So yeah, I'm on like Twitter, which Twitter, who knows what's happening with Twitter, but for now I'm on Twitter,
It's
and
on fire.
it's on fire. People are leaving it. I get it. I still share some stuff there. I'm honestly transitioning a bit to TikTok. Even though TikTok's not always cannabis friendly, it seems so far I can talk about cannabis policy and respond to people. And I think the algorithm's cool. And I also just like the same way that Twitter has become like a source for news. Like when you watch, we were talking about this before, like, or maybe I think I brought this up before, but if you do turn on the TV or something, like you'll see TikToks like 2 weeks after they were on TikTok. So being on the cutting edge, and if we can get a community of people talking about drug policy on Twitter or on TikTok, that'd be great. But I'm also on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram. Like I'm always
LinkedIn
trying.
is killer. I should have used that sooner for
Yeah, LinkedIn is cool. Like there's a balance. Like what I share on LinkedIn might not be the same as what I share on like I'm always just like experimenting with it. It feels like one giant experiment. So all that is to say, like find me on social media, whatever your platform is, if you're listening to this, and like reach out and we should talk. Yeah, and thank you for having me.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad that this worked for us and like we can do it again sometime too. And yeah.
I was hoping you'd
Yeah,
say that. Victoria, thank you so much for your time. This was lovely.
yeah, thank you so much.
Take care. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.